The winter of 1944 brought the cold not just to the fields of the Ardennes, but deep into the bone and spirit of the German war machine. It was not the cold of nature, but the cold, calculating logic of the world's most relentless, unfathomable abundance, colliding with the stark, desperate arithmetic of scarcity. At a frozen, insignificant crossroad near the crumbling Belgian town of Bastogne, where the forest canopy had been atomized by continuous shell fire, Oberleutnant Dieter Vogel, the temporary commander of a skeleton infantry company, laughed. It was not a laugh of triumph. It was a short, sharp bark of pure, desolate irony. He had just received the latest order from a headquarters that was already effectively vapor, demanding he hold his position against an impending counterattack that their intelligence, derived from captured cigarettes and discarded ration tins, estimated included at least one full American armored division. Vogel's entire fighting force was his 72 men, most of them teenagers or grandfathers, and a single, battered Sturmgeschütz, a tracked gun mounting that was, at that moment, spitting a thick blue-black smoke as its engine begged for oil it would never receive. He looked at the machine, a hunk of weary steel struggling against the tide, and then squinted up at the gray, indifferent sky. The American advance was preceded, as always, not by sound, but by its absence. The sudden, paralyzing quiet that meant the overwhelming machinery was being staged just beyond the horizon. For Vogel and his men, the war was fought at the scale of feet and hours, a brutal, close-quarter struggle for a single foxhole or a handful of frozen potatoes. Yet, 2 kilometers to the west, just beyond the thin line of desperate German observation, lay the American Forward Supply Depot, known only by its bureaucratic designation, Point 47 Delta. It was here that the true battle was being waged, not with bullets, but with logistics, and it was a battle the Germans had already lost, 10,000 times over. While Vogel's men shivered through a day subsisting on a watery ladle of thin turnip soup that delivered a paltry 450 calories. A starvation diet that was now the standard operating procedure for the front line. The American private, scarcely 500 meters away, enjoyed a daily allocation of fresh, canned, and processed foodstuffs designed to maintain a robust, war-fighting average of 3,000 calories. This stark, visceral contrast was the new engine of conflict. The ideological fervor of the German cause was dissolving in the face of the endless, monotonous bounty of the American industrial capacity. The sky offered the most compelling and most terrifying proof of this irreversible gap. High above Vogel's position, 3 American Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, known derisively by the Luftwaffe as fliegende Milchflaschen. Flying milk bottles, because of their corpulent, almost clumsy fuselages, circled with a casual, predatory confidence. The German pilots, men of skill and pedigree, mocked the P-47's unaerodynamic bulk. They laughed at its size, its lack of grace, its single heavy engine. But their laughter was hollow, a dying echo of an age of elegant, tailored warfare. The American engineers, driven by a philosophy of you unlimited resources, had simply designed a weapon that could carry more of everything. This was not a weapon of clever design. It was a weapon of pure, unadulterated industrial muscle. Each P-47, seemingly a bloated caricature of a fighter, mounted 8 50-caliber Saturn-Siat. Machine guns. The German Ace's Messerschmitt might carry 2 cannons and 2 machine guns, but the Thunderbolt carried a volume of fire that simply redefined destruction. A single P-47 could deliver 3,400 rounds. In one sustained burst, a veritable avalanche of steel and lead. When 3 of them rolled into a synchronized attack pattern on an exposed German column, the resulting hail was a 6-gun, 6,000 rounds per minute. Torrent, a devastating quantitative answer to qualitative excellence. This reality played out daily at .47 Delta, where the logistics officers, men who understood tonnage more than tactics, oversaw the uninterrupted, almost casual flow of materiel. The 7,000 tons of cargo that arrived daily at this single depot did not represent a heroic effort. It was simply the predictable outcome of an American economy operating at full tilt, its factory output reaching levels once thought fictional. This on 7,000 tons dot included everything from fresh tires to whole engines, from replacement bridge parts to millions of cigarettes. But overwhelmingly, it was fuel and ammunition. To Vogel, struggling to scrounge a single round of high explosive for his Sturmgeschütz, the scale was paralyzing. That single forward depot, one of hundreds, processed an amount of supply equivalent to the total annual production of many small European nations. It was the Marburg mathematics of logistics. So it made manifest a relentless systemic certainty that negated all human acts of courage or desperation. The knowledge of this ceaseless automatic machine churning out abundance with no sign of strain was the actual weapon that broke the German spirit, replacing ideological conviction not with fear, but with a fatalistic, deterministic defeat. The men ceased to be soldiers fighting a war of maneuver. They became statistical liabilities in an equation that had already been solved. And for many of them, the immediate future, the one place where that crushing, overwhelming tide of American abundance might become a source of immediate, personal, and uninterrupted sustenance, was not the collapsing front line, but the wire of the prisoner of war cage itself. As the German war machine evaporated into the smoke and ruin of the Western Front, the American response was not defined by exultation or vengeance, but by a logistical imperative. The rapid absorption of hundreds of thousands of enemy combatants, a staggering 371,000 men, a mass of humanity that represented merely another throughput problem for the vast, unemotional furnace of American industry. These prisoners were not shipped to dungeons or punitive fortifications. They were transferred to purpose-built, prefabricated cities of aluminum and canvas, constructed with terrifying, almost insulting speed across the American heartland. From the sun-blasted deserts of Arizona to the rich black loam of the Mississippi Delta, a chain of camps that dwarfed many genuine American towns. The mindset was clear. The captured enemy was not an ideological threat requiring ideological containment, but a bulk commodity, a temporary resident who required housing, feeding, and accounting, and the sheer efficiency with which this infrastructure materialized revealed the true nature of the power they had fought. The construction of these 155 major camps and their 511 auxiliary sites was a feat of engineering that required diverting material from the active war effort, yet the American supply chain barely registered the strain. It was, in the language of logistics, a negligible variance. The barbed wire that defined this new captivity was not wrought with hate, but with the dispassionate efficiency of the American steel mills, which produced the metric tonnage necessary to fence in an entire army, a quantity of metal that represented more steel than some German regions had been able to dedicate to civilian goods in the preceding decade. The scale of the operation was staggering, a living monument to the American capacity to convert raw materials into functional, necessary order. The entire endeavor, the transport, the feeding, the guarding, the heating, was powered by the same relentless energy stream that fueled the invasion of Europe. An energy stream drawn from the colossal American oil reserves, a resource base so vast that the war consumed 1.8 billion barrels. of crude oil over its duration, an amount that would have been unimaginable to the resource-starved Wehrmacht command. This was the true silent weapon of the Allies, the unlimited resources, that rendered all German acts of bravery irrelevant. Into this sprawling, engineered sanctuary stepped Sergeant Klaus Richter, a veteran panzer gunner captured near the Remagen bridgehead, a man whose anchor for technical struggle had been a constant, grinding battle against fuel contamination, low-grade lubricant, and the pervasive, agonizing fear of starvation. For 4 months, his diet had consisted of what the German supply lines could scrape together: a few ounces of ersatz coffee, gritty bread made with up to about 22% sawdust filler, and the occasional stolen potato. His entry into Camp Hearn in Texas was thus not a moment of dread, but one of surreal, stupefying disorientation. He was escorted past row upon row of perfectly aligned, identically sized wooden barracks, each one equipped with functioning plumbing, electric lights powered by generators running on endless pure gasoline, and a clean cot with 2 blankets, amenities that far surpassed the living standards of most non-commissioned officers still fighting inside the German borders. The moment of his psychological conversion, the instant the ideology of Götterdämmerung yielded to the cold reality of industrial supremacy, came at the first evening meal. Richter stood, weary and hollow-eyed, in a mess hall that, to his sensory memory, felt like a cathedral of heat and light. He watched a black cook, whose own country was built on scarcity, casually slice a loaf of genuine, unadulterated white bread, the soft, refined product of American agricultural might, and place 3 thick, heavy slices on his plate. Beside it lay a generous portion of beef stew, thick with real diced potatoes and carrots, and a side of canned peaches. The sheer visual density and perfection of the food, the genuine butter, the sugar-sweetened coffee, the thick, palpable meat, was overwhelming. Richter estimated the plate contained at least 2,500 calories, a single meal equivalent to 5 days of his rations at the front. The experience was not punitive. It was an act of accidental psychological warfare, a demonstration of capacity so profound it obliterated the very foundation of his belief system. An American guard, leaning lazily against a doorframe, watched the defeated man stare at his meal, a single, fat tear tracking a path through the grime on his cheek. The ultimate was that the American system, designed only for ruthless logistical efficiency in war, had inadvertently created the greatest sanctuary against that very war. The cost of maintaining this army of prisoners, providing them with housing, heating, food, and basic medical care, was calculated to be a colossal $120 million bomb per year. This operational expenditure, dedicated merely to holding the defeated enemy, represented an economic output that exceeded the total annual industrial production. Of essential goods, like ball bearings and precision optics, for the entire German war economy in the final year of the conflict, of our statistical reveal, confirming that American waste was, in and of itself, a weapon of unanswerable scale. For Klaus Richter and the hundreds of thousands like him, the truth was unavoidable. They were not merely prisoners of the Allied armies. They were prisoners of an industrial empire that could sustain them better in captivity than their own nation could sustain them in freedom. The sudden, bewildering security of the American camps did not extinguish the flames of ideology instantly. For the hardcore elements, the most devoted adherents of the National Socialist creed, it merely recast the struggle. The initial psychological response was the expected one: escape, defiance, and the immediate, desperate architectural pursuit of escape. Within the freshly erected barracks of Camp Papago Park Arizona, and Camp Concordia, Kansas, a secret internal hierarchy was maintained, enforced by senior German officers and fanatical non-commissioned officers who still believed in the myth of the Thousand-Year Reich, a myth they felt compelled to protect from the corrupting influence of American plenty. They continued to hold secret meetings, enforce an unwavering party line, and organize the construction of escape routes, turning their imprisonment into a new theater of operations. These acts of resistance, steeped in traditional military honor and ideological purity, served as rhetorical foils to the central, unyielding reality of their captivity, that their struggle was not against a brutal oppressor, but against an administrative indifference so complete it nullified their heroism. The contrast was stark. The internal world of the prisoners was one of fevered, desperate planning, while the external world, the sprawling American landscape, was one of overwhelming, well-fed tranquility. The most ambitious of these defiant acts was planned at Camp Papago Park, deep in the Arizona desert, a site chosen for its isolation, surrounded by miles of unyielding heat and rock. Here, a group of D-125-ton submarine officers and crew, men conditioned by the technical rigors of the U-boot service, conceived of a tunnel that was a masterpiece of clandestine engineering. Using scavenged tools, ration tins for digging, and ingeniously deployed camouflage, they spent months digging a subterranean passage on foot, 178 feet long, perfectly shored and ventilated, a technical marvel wrought from sheer, unbreakable will. Their plan was audacious: to emerge outside the wire, cross the treacherous desert, and steal a boat to sail down the Colorado River and into the Gulf of California, rejoining the war on their own terms. It was a mission born of the ideological belief that a soldier's duty was absolute, and that their personal commitment could somehow override the cold, crushing mathematics of defeat they had witnessed. The men, led by Oberleutnant zur See Jürgen Degen, and Zeitung Anchor for ideological viewpoint, saw themselves not as prisoners, but as deep-cover agents preparing for the next offensive. On the night of December 23, 1944, the men executed their plan. They slipped through the tunnel's mouth and into the cool, dark embrace of the desert, finally free of the ubiquitous, demoralizing abundance of the American supply chain. This was the climax at the midpoint of the prisoners' ideological struggle. The escape was initially a perfect, exhilarating success, a triumph of human endeavor over logistical constraint. They marched for 2 days, driven by the memory of burning oil and sinking ships, sustained by the last dregs of their ideological fervor and the few dried rations they had secretly hoarded. They were masters of the sea, not the desert, and the vast, bewildering emptiness of the American West proved a far more formidable enemy than any guard tower. Their worn boots, used to the slick steel of a submarine deck, left fresh, clear tracks in the soft sand. The boss, a counterintuitive scenario, began to unfold not with an alarm, but with a scent. After 2 days of movement, weakened by the desert and the deep metabolic deficits created by years of wartime deprivation, their focus shifted from the distant sea to an unbearable, overwhelming sensory intrusion. They had fought starvation for years, and the sight of canned beef and white bread in the camp had been a psychological challenge. But the sheer, sensory promise of freedom's food was an entirely different assault. A local Arizona farmer, driving into town, noticed the fresh tracks heading inexplicably toward the distant highway. He alerted the local sheriff, who simply followed the path of least resistance, a path that led directly to the shimmering neon sign of a small, isolated roadside diner. The escapees had succumbed not to bullets or overwhelming force, but to the irresistible, powerful aroma of frying bacon and fresh coffee, an act of sheer, visceral biological surrender. They had walked into the diner, gaunt and filthy, and ordered the entire contents of the breakfast menu. Sheriff Joe Tanner found them sitting in a booth, eating with a desperate, animalistic focus, not attempting to flee, not resisting. The ultimate, humiliating irony was complete. Their ideological fight was defeated by a simple, overcooked American breakfast. As he was being loaded into the back of a civilian truck, Oberleutnant Dagan, the defiant architect of the escape, looked out at the impossibly wide, unbroken ribbon of the American highway, its asphalt smooth, its traffic constant, and unhurried. He offered a simple, defeated primary source quote that articulated the profound psychological shift of the entire war. The country is too big. The world we knew is just gone. The human event shifted the narrative focus permanently, revealing that for the thousands of German soldiers observing this endless land of plenty, the fight was over, and the only logical response was a deep, paralyzing resignation that made the Golden Cage an unexpected haven. The logistical calculus that defined the POW camps extended far beyond mere custody. It seamlessly transitioned the captured military personnel into a temporary, utilized workforce. As the American economy strained against the manpower vacuum created by global conflict, the prisoners ceased being enemy combatants and became, in the unapologetic military business history of the logistical mind, a vast, conscripted labor pool. This was the moment the prisoners gained unmediated, daily access to the greatest industrial product the United States had ever created, its civilian life. The War Department instituted extensive work programs, deploying over 400,000 prisoners to fields and non-military factories, transforming the vanquished into essential cogs in the victory machine. They were paid a small wage, 80 cents a day, credited to their eventual return. And their lives settled into a rhythm of labor that was shockingly normal, a profound disjunction from the frantic chaos of the front. It was during a scorching season in Texas that Hans Schmidt, an anonymous figure captured during the retreat through France, came face to face with the true nature of American power. Schmidt, a farmer's son from the Rhine Valley, was assigned to a massive cotton plantation outside of Lubbock. He was a prisoner, yet he was tasked with harvesting a crop vital to the American economy. His daily existence now revolved around the technical jargon of agricultural production. 200 pounds of cotton picked per day, the optimization of bushels per acre, and the careful maintenance of equipment. What astonished him was not the cotton itself, but the sheer, effortless modernity of the tools used to extract it. He had spent his youth struggling behind oxen and repairing broken, decades-old implements. On the Texas farm, he was introduced to the latest model of the John Deere tractor, a vast, six-cylinder engine of iron and power, gleaming green and yellow, perfectly maintained and fueled by the endless stream of petroleum that powered the entire Allied war effort. Schmidt saw this machine not as a piece of farm equipment, but as a monument to systematic security. Its tires were thick, new, and abundant. Its steel frame was solid, not pieced together from salvaged scrap. The tractor was, in its own way, as devastating a weapon as the P-47, an engine of peaceful, overwhelming dominance. This juxtaposition of technical jargon and sensory reality was inescapable. At night, after working his allotted eat-an-hour, Schmidt was returned to his auxiliary camp near the farm. He was tired, but he was fed. Real eggs, real ham, and always the fresh white bread that represented the triumph of advanced milling and transportation. He watched the farm owner's family eat dinner, their house brightly lit by a grid of electric power that never failed, their children playing on a clean, wooden porch, insulated from the distant, grinding violence. There was no blackout, no air raid alarm, no fear etched into the face of the farm wife. The distance from the war was not merely geographical, it was systemic security, a kind of engineered peace the European mind could barely comprehend. Schmidt realized that the relentless output of the American factory was directed not solely at tanks and bombers, but also at maintaining this profoundly stable, almost boring civilian rhythm. This was the most effective propaganda of all, the daily, sensory experience of a society that could produce both the tools of utter destruction and the comforts of effortless, unthreatened domesticity without visible strain. One evening, while fixing a loose fence post on the far edge of the property, a simple, conscious choice presented itself. The guard assigned to his small detail was distracted, leaning against a post, reading a comic book. The town was less than a mile away, and the uniform he wore, a simple fatigue outfit adapted for labor, would not immediately betray him. Escape was simple, a matter of a few minutes of walking, and then blending into the enormous, featureless landscape. But Hans Schmidt paused, his eyes not on the horizon of freedom, but on the brightly lit windows of the farmhouse. He calculated the variables. If he escaped, he would be cold, hunted, hungry, and eventually returned to a defeated, ruined Germany with nothing. If he stayed, he had 3 regular meals a day, a clean cot, and the temporary, astonishing privilege of being a participant in a society that worked flawlessly and abundantly. His mind's psychological shift was complete. The choice was not between captivity and freedom. It was between the certainty of systemic scarcity and the certainty of systemic abundance. The ideological imperative of a broken, dying state was nothing against the overwhelming pull of a society that functioned. His eventual, conscious decision to turn back, to return to the illuminated camp, was the chapter's core argument made manifest. The American lifestyle was the ultimate, irresistible industrial product, and Hans Schmidt, the German farmer's son, chose to remain adjacent to its never-ending supply chain. The spring of 1945 brought not an easing of logistical burdens, but a sudden, frantic acceleration, a frantic clearing of the administrative deck. On May 8th, the cessation of hostilities in Europe was formalized, marking the end of the conflict and the beginning of a fresh, overwhelming logistical challenge for the American command: the repatriation of the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners who had become an entrenched, if temporary, feature of the American landscape. The dramatic, rhythmic pacing accelerates. As the military machinery, having mastered the art of delivery, now sought to master the art of disposal, the official desire was bureaucratic and absolute: clear the camps, sever the economic liability, and return the men to a defeated, ruined continent. But it was in this moment of official freedom that the ironic scenario fully manifested, revealing the profound, systemic victory the American industrial complex had unwittingly achieved. The vast majority of the prisoners, having found sanctuary within the heart of their enemy, actively resisted the call to go home. The third-person limited perspective offered a glimpse into this baffling refusal. For men like Siegfried Emil Kraus, who had survived the siege of Leningrad only to be captured months later, the word freedom had become synonymous with starvation. He remembered the precise, devastating detail of post-war German communiques, relayed through the camp grapevine, describing the utter destruction of the infrastructure, the lack of medical supplies, and the desperate daily search for firewood and food. To return was not an emotional reunion. It was a voluntary entry into the mathematics of defeat, an equation where the variables were not glory or ideology, but fractions of a ration card and the looming threat of the black market. The choice was clear. Remain adjacent to the item, unlimited resources and unquartor of the United States, even as a prisoner awaiting transit, or willingly step into the vacuum. The evidence of this collective, profound psychological shift was startlingly numerical. Obtained by DAFOM, statistical reveal that shocked the military administrators charged with closing the golden cage. Across the American system of camps, the official count of men who filed formal paperwork requesting continued employment, asylum, or permanent immigration reached an astonishing total of 34,000 requests. This was not merely apathy. It was a deliberate, quantitative rejection of their homeland in favor of proximity to abundance. The prisoners' resistance was expressed through a campaign of quiet, bureaucratic sabotage. Men feigned chronic, debilitating illnesses that required extensive, time-consuming medical evaluations. Others manufactured convoluted and entirely fictitious claims of statelessness, asserting residency in former territories to delay their processing. Within the processing barracks, groups of prisoners would organize minor, yet effective, forms of resistance, misfiling their own identification cards, intentionally damaging the fragile paperwork of their peers, or refusing to confirm their identity until provided with unnecessary and complex paperwork. The frustration this caused the American logistical machine was immense, a direct clash between the efficiency of the victors and the weary resignation of the vanquished. American officers, who saw the war's end as a clean, definitive break, could not comprehend the prisoners' longing for continued confinement. Colonel Thomas Rourke, the commanding officer of Camp Shanks, a major repatriation point, was recorded delivering a short, sharp remark to his staff that captured the absurdity of the situation. It was minimal, but impactful. Dialogue. They act like they're being sent to the gallows, not home to their families. The truth was that to the German prisoners, these acts of resistance were entirely logical. Having witnessed the overwhelming power of the American domestic supply chain, the sheer, unassailable fact of its technical, industrial supremacy, they saw no future in the ruins. They had been exposed to a system that could feed, clothe, and provide medical care to hundreds of thousands of enemies without visible strain, and the memory of that abundance eclipsed all romantic or patriotic notions of returning to the struggle. For them, the great paradox of the Second World War was this: the only true safety lay behind the very wire that denoted defeat. Freedom, if it meant going back to the destroyed, starving landscape of Central Europe, was a terrible and unnecessary burden. They had discovered that the final, most desirable product of the American factory was not the bomb, the plane, or the tank, but the promise of an ordinary, well-fed life, and they would do anything to keep themselves within its orbit. The story of the German prisoners, who chose the American wire over their own crumbling freedom, was not a footnote of human interest, nor was it a testament to the sudden conversion to the principles of democracy. It was, rather, a data-supported conclusion to the entire conflict, an ultimate, unsolicited endorsement of the most chilling truth revealed by World War II, that our technical, industrial supremacy is the final, unanswerable weapon of geopolitical power. Their resistance to repatriation was a purely logical, almost technical decision, a choice between the statistical certainty of scarcity in a ruined homeland and the statistical certainty of sustenance in the heart of the enemy's abundance. They had seen behind the curtain of the American war effort, witnessed the seamless conversion of 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil and millions of tons of steel into an endless, self-sustaining flow of food and materials, and they found that truth irresistible. The choice was not ideological, it was thermodynamic. The American administrative machine, however, could not abide this contradiction. The presence of 371,000 nor. Foreign soldiers on American soil was a logistical anomaly that had to be corrected. Despite the fervent pleas and administrative resistance mounted by the 34,000 who formally begged to stay, the bureaucratic gears of repatriation ground on with relentless, indifferent authority. The administrative headaches caused by this silent mutiny were immense, taxing the dwindling wartime resources of the Transport Command as ships were prepared for the long, westward journey. The ultimate fate of the majority was dictated by national interest and international accord. They were going home. The narrative of their reluctant forced return was played out against a somber, emotional tone. A procession of men who saw themselves not as liberated, but as exiled from the land of plenty. They were not marching to victory, but shuffling toward a continent of rubble and hunger, toward the ashes of their own failed, resource-starved ideology. As the ship sailed across the cold, gray Atlantic, the true legacy of the golden cage began to take shape. This generation of returned soldiers, the hundreds of thousands who had worked on American farms and in American auxiliary factories, had been granted a unique, raw, and unmediated vision of industrial society functioning at its zenith. They had seen the enemy's system not through propaganda lenses, but through the simple, daily reality of full stomachs and working light bulbs. They had witnessed the systemic security, the boundless energy, and the material certainty that defined the American life, a life built upon the vast, self-replenishing, unlimited resources that had been entirely unavailable to the Reich. These men returned to Germany not as bitter ideologues, but as reluctant, yet ultimately effective agents of industrial change. Their testimony was undeniable, their experience a powerful, authoritative, revelatory counterpoint to the desperate lies of the war years. They spoke not of American political systems, but of the weight of the steel, the reliability of the tractors, the endless shelves of the stores, and the simple, astonishing fact that everyone was well fed. This became the psychological bedrock upon which the post-war nation, the Federal Republic of Germany, was built. The generation that witnessed the ultimate power of production would never again pursue an ideological course that clashed with the logical certainty of material supply. They became the first and most willing disciples of the Western economic model, ensuring Germany's willing and relentless integration into the Western, production-driven world order. The colossal scale of American war output, the final unanswerable weapon, had not only won the war, it had fundamentally reshaped the aspirations of the defeated. The prisoners' desperate choice to cling to captivity was the ultimate proof that in the modern era, the true engine of geopolitical power is not the strength of the soldier's conviction, but the morrison mathematics of logistics, and the unwavering, terrible cost of industrial certainty. The ultimate victory was not a flag raising, but the transformation of the enemy's will into an earnest, overwhelming desire for the very abundance that had defeated them.